Well, good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to welcome you to a very special MI Colloquium. This is the meeting where we co-sponsor with Beta Phi Mu, and we are delighted today to welcome Keathi, I'm not sure, Keathi Adolfo and Stephen Kruger to our stage. So just a few things before we get started. So our presentation tonight is called Beyond Trans 101, Practical Gender Inclusion Strategies for LIS Professionals. And a couple things. So we are recording a video of this, and it will be available on the MI Colloquial playlist, and also will be posted to the Canvas course site for you to also access. Do please stay muted throughout the presentation, but you can, of course, we do like a lively chat, so put your questions in the chat. I don't have a Q&A set up, but we also, again, will either hold your questions or we will ask them towards the end. And these questions, if we actually talk about these questions, will be part of the recording and the video. However, we're also going to have an unrecorded Q&A after the main presentation ends, and that will start at 8 p.m. So our sponsors for tonight are, again, Beta Phi Mu, the New Jersey Center for the Book, RU Libraries, and the Sky LIS Department, and the Sky Alumni Association. So our agenda here, well, I'm obviously welcoming you right now, and then I'm going to introduce Emil, and he's going to give, he is the faculty faculty sponsor, not quite sure, faculty
Advisor.
Advisor, thank you, Emil, for Beta Phi Mu. Then we're going to also introduce James, and then we'll get our main presentation rolling at that point in time. And without further ado, I'd like you all to meet Emil Lawrence. Emil is an assistant professor of library and information science. Again, the faculty sponsor or advisor for NJ Beta Phi Mu. Again, his research is around normative research on issues arising at the intersection of library and information and ethics, readers and reading and aesthetics. So with that, welcome, Emil. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Connie, for that introduction and also, as always, for all of the work that you do to organize and host this program. And good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Fall Beta Phi Mu Omicron Chapter Speaker Series and MI Colloquium. I'd like to take this opportunity to speak very briefly about Beta Phi Mu, which is the International Honor Society for Library and Information Science and Information Technology. It operates with the motto LIS in serviendo consumere, which means consumed in the service of others. The Omicron chapter of Rutgers University was started in 1970, and we operate under that same belief in the high value librarian's place on service. To be invited to be a member of the Omicron chapter here at Rutgers, students must obtain a cumulative GPA of no lower than 3.75 and be recommended by a faculty member. So should you meet these criteria, you may be invited to join the chapter. All right, with that, I would like now to introduce the current president of the Beta Phi Mu Omicron chapter, James Fahey. James is an adult services librarian at Plainsboro Public Library, where he manages the digital book, magazine, and database collections. James also organizes art gallery exhibits, music events, seminars in emerging technologies, and professional and career development programs. In addition, he develops partnerships between the library and area businesses. Beyond his work in the library, James serves as president, of course, of the Omicron chapter and has helped found the NJLA marketing section and now serves as past president. Prior to getting his LIS degree 4 years ago, James spent about 30 years leading emerging technology companies. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you, James.
Thank you, Emil. First, I would like to recognize my colleagues on the Omicron chapter board. You've already met Dr. Emil Lawrence, who is our faculty advisor, Chelsea Rizzolo, our vice president, Chelsea Barrett, our past president, Ruby Constantino is here. She's our secretary, Laura Cummings, our membership chair, and Juliana Rossano, who is our communications chair. Beta Phi Mu's mission includes both academic and scholarship and library leadership. So it's both academic scholarship and library leadership. The vast majority of Omicron chapter members are practicing librarians, not academics. So I've always felt that we should emphasize the leadership side of Beta Phi Mu missions in our Omicron chapter activities and guest speakers. An important part of leadership is empathy. In many corporate environments, empathy is in short supply, and leaders have to work hard to cultivate it. That does not seem to be the case in libraries. Librarians may be disproportionately introverts, but we care profoundly about our patrons and our colleagues. In mid-August, when the chapter board found ourselves thinking about a topic for this colloquium, empathy told us what the topic needed to be. The biggest single crisis facing library staff today is the assault faced by our LGBTQ plus colleagues. I am proud to be a librarian today. Connie has told us that despite a determined effort to keep our promotion of this event as concise as possible because of concerns for the safety of both the speakers and the participants, registrations are among the highest among Rutgers MI colloquia. That can only be because librarians care. They understand the importance of the subject, and they want to know how they can support their colleagues. That's why we are hosting this event. That's why so many of us are here today. Our speakers have declined further introduction. They will tell you more about themselves in the course of the presentation. So without further delay, here they are.
All right, just checking that everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
We can.
And I'm not going to be watching the chat, but I do need Emil to know that there's great desire to know the name of the cat in the photo, so please provide that information. So let's see. We'll start by doing brief introductions. Those were basically on the screen, but I'm Stephen Kruger, pronouns AM or he, him. I think they, them without the TH. For mine, I am the Affordable Course Content Librarian at the University of Kentucky. I'm about maybe 8 years out of library school now, and worked in a bunch of different places. I also have done, but the reason I mention that is because what we'll be talking about today is extremely not my day job. It's not my co-presenter's day job. This is work that a lot of us are doing on the side or as scholarly research, but we're also doing like practical librarian jobs. So that said, Keahi, do you want to take your turn?
Yes, I am Keahi Adelpho, they, them, and he, him pronouns. I'm a processing archivist at Virginia Commonwealth University Libraries in Richmond, Virginia. Also graduated 8 years ago. It's just a thing, I guess. Yeah, worked in the Midwest in Florida and now here. That's all I got.
We do have a lot of content to get through. This is a very rich topic. So we will be getting started and moving relatively quickly. We're not doing Trans 101 today. That is because every time I try to squeeze that into a talk about something else, that ends up taking the whole time. That's what people have the most questions about. And frankly, we are kind of bored of doing it. There's a whole lot of information out there available. So the point of this is if you would like information about trans and gender diverse people, about gender identity, not in a library context, but just in general, the QR code here, and if someone wants to grab the link and put those, if someone has access to the slides, that will take you to a blog post I wrote for Choice last spring. That's resources I recommend for Trans 101. They're fairly in-depth they're both in-depth, and also I still think they're all 101 level because of the level of ignorance about this topic that is prevalent. I very strongly recommend that you go look at these, regardless of whether some of this seems like review, but especially if it doesn't. This is not information that a lot of us were taught. It's not something that is present in a lot of education systems in the US or frankly anywhere. It is not people's fault that if this is something you have an area of ignorance on, it is your responsibility to remedy it once you recognize that ignorance. We are not going to help you do that today. We are going to move on to the practical applications, but we did want to provide the materials for doing that self-education yourself. So extremely highly recommend exploring those resources. All right. I know I like to know what to expect when I'm attending a talk, so I'm going to tell you what we're going to say, and then we're going to say it. Um, so we're going to start with why we're even talking about this. James touched on this a little bit, but we'll get into more detail about the specifics of why this topic is important to library workers. We will be talking about who needs to be involved in gender inclusion work. Spoiler alert, it is everyone, literally. But we'll talk a little bit. There's honestly not more depth to that. It's just everyone all the time. But we'll talk about when and more importantly, how to get started with that work, specifically in various types of library roles. We'll be giving examples of what this kind of work can look like, and at the end there will be discussion, but like Connie said, that discussion will not be recorded. That's for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm going to assume people can gather, so we're going to move on. Guidelines for how this works. We are extremely not the only experts on this topic in general. I would be shocked if we were the only people who knew anything about trans topics and trans issues in libraries in this room. So ask questions, use the chat, ask questions of each other, learn from each other as well. If someone posts a question in the chat that you know the answer to, or if you have resources that you can share, do that, learn from each other. That is both because like that's just useful in this space, but also because we're doing a one-shot talk here. You are in a community where you can continue learning from each other, and we would like you to really establish that, the habit of doing that on this topic. So don't feel like you need us to answer a question to get answers. And if you have something to say that you are comfortable saying, do that. Like I said, ignorance on these topics is not anything to be ashamed of because there is a reason, and there is a fairly malicious reason that ignorance is so prevalent. But you do need to then be aware of that and take steps to address it. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. The resources I shared on the previous slide are a starting point. They're very much a starting point. Let's see. A rule specifically about this kind of context. Use the information you learned today. I have found that in these spaces, people often share personal information about themselves, about people they know, about coworkers. Do not share identifying information related to people's gender identities or their experiences. Do not take that out of this space. I'm going to assume that anyone sharing that here is an act of trust. Do not betray that trust. Simultaneously, you can't trust a space like this with a relatively open registration. We have done what we can to make this a good faith area. There's nothing we can do to guarantee that. So I would recommend against sharing anything in the chat or verbally in the discussion that you are not comfortable with being shared outside of this. So I wish that were not the case, but it is. So protect yourself and the people you were talking about. I strongly recommend anonymizing stories if you need to share them. So do with that context what you will. And again, this is the beginning, not an end. I hope you don't treat this as a checkbox. I went to a trans inclusion training and now I know how to do that in my job. I hope it will be clear that the content here doesn't let you do that. This content is useless if you don't go and use it broadly. But treat this as the start of a topic, something that I know a lot of people, this may be the first time you've learned about this topic.
Okay, this is me. So to start with, trans and gender diverse people are not a monolith. So mine and Stephen's perspectives and experiences are our own, and they might not reflect, the experiences or perspectives of other trans and gender diverse people. We're also not a hive mind, so Stephen and I don't speak for everyone. What we consider a best practice, might not be what someone else considers a best practice, and a lot of times what the actual best practice is really depends on the particular situation. There's lots of variables centering the needs of whoever's being affected and what's being discussed. Lastly, Stephen and I are qualified to present on this topic not because we're trans, but because we've done the work to learn about trans and gender diverse issues in libraries. So transitioning doesn't automatically download gender inclusion stuff to our brains, unfortunately. We had to go teach ourselves, and you too can teach yourself about gender inclusion. Next slide. So why are we talking about this? Why is this important? Why do we care about gender inclusion? Basically, trans people, gender diverse people exist. The US Trans Survey in 2022 had over 90,000 respondents from all 50 states and the rest of the US empire. People were living, throughout the whole area, 41% in the South, about 20% in the West, the Northeast, and the Midwest. So we live everywhere. Basically, no matter where your library school or your library is, there have been or will be trans and gender diverse people, as students, professors, employees, volunteers, patrons, etc. So Additionally, gender inclusion work is categorized as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI work, which, is increasingly framed as this special treatment people are getting. Even before the current administration, I've seen DEI work be framed as optional work to take on if you have, the time, the staffing, the interest, and the expertise. Like, it was great if it happened, but it wasn't a baseline requirement for your job. I really wish that years ago as a profession, we had pushed back on that framing. But to be very clear, DEI work is addressing a gap. So if you're doing inclusion work for a specific group, it means that that group has been excluded. Inclusion is a much more, PR-friendly way of saying we've been actively and passively excluding, erasing, or mistreating a group of people, and now we're making small steps to not do that so much. So libraries are not starting from a neutral space where nothing was happening to trans and gender diverse people, and now we can start being intentionally inclusive. Libraries have historically, and they continue to exclude, erase, and harm trans and gender diverse people. And you're all here because you're interested in learning how to not do that. Anything else? / next slide.
Yeah, just to make that on a very practical level, about that last bit, the way I think about it, by the time a trans person, employee, patron, whatever, comes and tells you your library is doing something that excludes them, other people have already just quietly left. So this isn't like, don't think of this as like a nice bonus thing. We're not coming from like neutral to making things better. This is harm mitigation. So a lot of the examples we'll talk about, these are things we talk in libraries a lot about the invisible user. At least in my library school program we did. So that may be familiar terminology, but just like people who either never come in or who leave and we don't know why. This is why for a lot of people.
Cool. So gender is culturally and socially constructed. Different cultures have different gender systems. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of indigenous genders out there globally. Even cultures that have the same genders, they've historically had different ideas about gender roles, expectations, etc. Even the same culture, gender changes over time. Looking at the 20th century, how long hair has been for men, pants for women, whatever. Things change over time. So gender is personal and it defies easy categorization. And this is all important because you will not always know when someone is trans or gender diverse. So gender inclusion is not something that you can apply on the spot when it becomes relevant because you will not always know when it's relevant. So here is a short list of things that trans and gender diverse people may or may not do. We may change our names socially, legally, or both, change our gender markers on some or all ID documents, change our pronouns, medically transition through hormone replacement therapy and/or surgeries, change our presentation and appearance, change which restrooms we use, come out to specific people in specific settings, to everyone, no one. And these things may happen, multiple times, single times, whatever, and this list isn't comprehensive. So keep it in mind because it's important to understand that gender inclusion in libraries must account for all possibilities and not just, some possibilities to be really inclusive. And I will give an example to illustrate this. So I once had a trans library worker reassure me that a particular library was really great to work in if you're trans, and he had specifically referenced an HR person. And I later interacted with this HR person, and she asked me about trans inclusive hiring practices. And during this conversation, she ended up insisting that trans people should have to dead name themselves on job applications if they've not legally changed their name. And she compared this to criminals applying for jobs with fake names, and then also told me that my pronouns were grammatically incorrect, so I should understand that librarians in particular would really struggle with it. I went back to my colleague and told him about my experiences, and he was very surprised because he had such good experiences with her. So the point of the story is that sometimes individuals or institutions are inclusive and welcoming to a very specific type or specific, individuals who are trans or gender diverse, and it's easy to mistake that as meaning that they are inclusive and welcoming generally to all trans and gender diverse people. And it's important to realize that a lot of times the inclusion relies on certain assumptions. So, libraries or individuals might handle people well if they're binary and pass as cis, if they've medically transitioned before they started working there, if they go by their legal name, if they don't use neopronouns, etc. So just because some trans people are having a good experience, it doesn't mean that your library or library program is welcoming to all trans and gender diverse people. So it's important to keep in mind that we all have different experiences, and because of these experiences, inclusion, may or may not be happening already. Anything you want to add before the next slide, Stephen?
For another very practical example, maybe your library has an all-gender restroom. Can someone in a wheelchair use that restroom? In many libraries, the answer is no. So there are all sorts of ways in which this comes up. The way I tend to think about this as well is that it's really, really common for changes in libraries and other places to get made once a trans person starts working there, once an importantly, openly trans person starts working there or comes into the library or something. I would very strongly encourage you to break away from that mindset. This work cannot be responsive by the time like I said, by the time one person complains, other people have already left. But you are not going to know who this work helps. That's for all sorts of reasons, one of which is which you cannot, like, if you remember nothing else, remember, you can't tell someone's gender by the way they look, or sound, or their voice, or anything else except they tell you. So you aren't going to know who this work helps, and that is how it should be. You shouldn't know that. You have to do it anyway.
Yeah. So who should do this work? As Stephen said before, literally everybody. And we cannot stress this enough, but please stop relying on trans and gender diverse people to do this work, even though we might sometimes be really interested in doing so. It is really disheartening realizing that your presence and your interest means that all of your coworkers are not doing the work to self-educate and they just push the work onto you. So everyone should be doing this work, and in order to do that work responsibly and not, inadvertently create more harm, you have to do self-education first. Next slide. So when do we do this work? Whenever your library or a library school first started existing, that is when the work should have started happening there. And for you personally, whenever your library career started is when you should have started. But if you cannot time travel, the next right time to start this work is right now. As Stephen said, a lot of library schools and libraries make the mistake of waiting until they receive a complaint. By the time an issue is raised, multiple folks have already been harmed. The first time you hear a complaint is very, very, very rarely the first time, someone is harmed. I think, Stephen, you also already said this. You're just like reading my mind. I was the first out trans person at 2 libraries I worked at, and they both had gender inclusion trainings before I started, and they, thought they had implemented a lot of things. And they didn't realize how much they still had to implement until I started working there, and they saw the problems that I ran into. So, every time I started a library, they boast about their wonderful preferred name system and how far-reaching and perfect it is. And every place that I worked, I had to inform them of the limits of that system, that it didn't reach the phone directory or our Google counts, or whatever automatically leads to them printing out name tags that they put on tables at trainings, and you go there and all your coworkers are there. Didn't reach that for some reason. So every single time I have worked somewhere, they've been surprised about how they thought that a gap was covered and it wasn't. And these are things that you can usually figure out before somebody starts. So look for problems, basically. Look for gaps and issues, because I guarantee they are there, and it's really disheartening to stumble upon that on your first day. It is you now.
Because I am the one screen sharing, I can't see the little notes where we put who was saying which slides, so I'm reliant on being told which ones I'm supposed to talk for. So we aren't going to leave it at that. Actually, the whole point of this presentation is intended to give you the tools you need to figure out what that work means for you. So to be clear, we aren't going to give you a list of things you can go do. We are going to give, well, we are kind of, but we aren't going to give you a list of specific actions you can do. We are going to give you a structure and a framework for figuring out what those actions are for your specific job, for your specific role, because increasingly it becomes clear the meaningful work is, maybe it has overlap, but it's incredibly specific. Like, I used to be an institutional repository manager. The things that I would do, I'll give some of those examples later, but those strategies for gender inclusion are completely useless to anyone not managing an institutional repository. Okay, he's going to talk about archives. I will have no idea what they're talking about, because this work, I'll talk about bathrooms. A lot of people have more understanding of that, but again, like, my current job has nothing to do with bathrooms except that I have to use them, which is a different thing. So the whole point of this is giving you the tools to figure out what that work is and how to do it in your specific context. All right, so the first step is to think about, we have numbered steps later, but this is the step 0, baby. I think this ties into the slide that was talked about before with things trans and gender diverse people may or may not do, because we are not a monolith. We all do or do completely different things, but there are some patterns that you can look for that affect a lot of trans and gender diverse people. And these are the most common things that we have come across in library contexts that affect people that often cause harm. So these are the general things to keep an eye out for. So in your different positions. So one is just information collected in whether that's verbally or in writing or in various systems or submitted by candidates or on the library card form or whatever. Information around names, genders, pronouns, and very importantly, like was just discussed, where and how this information displays, which can be really difficult to track down, but that is one of the most important things. Another giant issue is gendered spaces. That can mean, often that means restrooms. It can also mean events and resources. So I'm not a public librarian. I've worked in public libraries a little bit, but like say you're doing a book display of authors of a certain gender. That is a gendered event or resource, depending on how you frame it. If your library is hosting an event for girls in STEM, that is a gendered event. So we'll talk about kind of what that can mean. Language is another really common one. This can be library policies. This can be things like the handbook says he or she when we would recommend making it they, them. So you're not excluding anyone who doesn't use he or she pronouns from assuming that they work in your library. Conversation is a trickier one and because that's about training and how people interact with each other, but it's a really, really common issue. Benefits is something that applies a lot more on the library worker side, but is a huge deal for a lot of trans people and can often be a deal breaker in whether a job will work for us. Reporting discrimination and harassment is sort of nebulous. Mostly what I mean here, and I don't have solutions. This is not one where I'm giving practical solutions. This is just very complicated and difficult to navigate sometimes. I mean, I don't think it's that complicated, frankly, but library HR tends to seem to think so. But this is things like, does your library consider misgendering intentionally to be harassment? What does it do when there's a situation that's not like, this is clearly a sexual harassment or whatever, but like this is coworkers going after someone for their gender identity or patrons going after someone for their gender identity. It is incredibly common in public libraries for that just not to be a thing that there's a structure to deal with. So when we talk about discrimination and harassment, it's like what support and systems do trans and gender diverse people have in place in your library when these things happen? And are these considered discrimination in your libraries? Can you please tell me if I do slides that you were supposed to do?
You're still good.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. Anything to add to the last bit?
I guess I would add for like the harassment and discrimination is that a lot of people, when you do complain about a coworker misgendering you, there's this sort of like they're learning be patient framework, and there has to be a point at which people are expected to have learned something. And that's something that I encourage folks to like try defining because that can go on for years where it's like they're still learning, and at some point that doesn't work anymore.
I was in a meeting literally yesterday, like a large library faculty meeting where a fully tenured librarian talked about a coworker who uses they, them pronouns and used the wrong pronouns for the entire talk, despite the fact that everyone around her was using the pronouns correctly. And also the pronouns were on a large screen on a slide at the front of the room. Like there was no possible excuse. And at that point, the excuse is always going to be that they forget, it's hard to remember verbally. At a certain point, it does not matter. And that just crosses a line where I did talk about ignorance is not a moral failing. There's a point at which the ignorance becomes unforgivable when you are actively refusing to make any changes. All right, so this actually kind of gets into, so the previous slide, these were all like pretty solid practical issues that you can identify relatively easily. The solutions may be a lot more difficult, but sometimes the problem is much more difficult to navigate. And this is also where we don't have solutions. We just really needed to acknowledge that this is one of this can be the defining factor in whether a place is good or difficult for trans people. This is about like the behavior of the people in that space. This may be your coworkers as librarians. This may be your professors if you're a library student. feel free to ask in the Q&A about the book project we did and what the library students who wrote chapters for it talked about. It's bleak. This may be your classmates, and thus also your future coworkers in many cases, or your future professors, or professors who are future library students. Also library patrons. So I don't think I'm going to actually spend a lot of time on this because we aren't presenting this as we have practical solutions, but this is like, if this stuff isn't solved, if this kind of ignorance and ill intent is permitted in a workplace, it simply has no reason to stop. So that's more big picture, especially if people are going into HR or library leadership or have the kind of power where you can change a workplace dynamic. This is a huge issue. Essentially, as I think was clear by now, we're not talking about library patrons here. We are talking about everyone who is in and around library spaces. That's patrons, employees, volunteers, board members, library professors, library students. It is everyone. So we say this because in our experience, the vast majority of publications about gender inclusion in libraries is patron focused. It's about how to make patrons feel welcome in a library. It's about how to study the information behavior of trans and gender diverse people. There is very little of it that focuses on library employees. There's almost nothing that focuses on trans and gender diverse library students. I've seen literally nothing about trans and gender diverse library professors. So if someone is looking for research topics, those are completely untouched as far as I can tell. But in terms of the practical stuff, this is about everyone who is in and around libraries. So all that information before about trans and gender diverse people exist in all of these spaces, that's not just in your community, that's in all of these different roles in your libraries. Anything to add slash, I don't remember who was running this bit.
This is you. I'm doing step 2, so you have this in the next one.
Excellent. Any thoughts on that last bit before we move on to the practical? Wonderful.
Yeah, you did it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Validation. All right, so this is the meat of this talk. So this is where we're really getting into, this is a structure that we've essentially developed for assuming an audience of people who have probably, I hope, done the Trans 101, or at the very least are just generally well-meaning about trans and gender diverse people. So once you're on board with that, like once you're on board with trans and gender diverse people exist, they're in my library in various spaces. I'm not going to know who they are because I shouldn't know that necessarily. What do I actually do to make my not even my library, my specific aspect of the library more gender inclusive? And I'm using that framing on purpose. I'm not saying this fixes it. This doesn't bring us to a state of trans and gender diverse people have equally good experiences as cis people do. This is making things less bad. So this is about finding the concrete things that you, in whatever role you are, can do to make things less bad. Because I promise there is something. That is what we want you to take away from this. There is something that you can do, and your job is to figure out what that is and then do it. So step 1, figure out what those issues are. So that's why we started with that list of, well, the several lists of things trans and gender diverse people might do in our various lives, and also the practical issues that impact us. So these slides are going to be shared. We pulled a lot of this from an article I wrote that's open access that for practical academic librarianship that is literally titled How to Gender Include, because I was feeling grumpy and they let me keep the title, and I'm very happy about that. So step 1, go through those lists and look for which of those issues stick out as my job has something to do with this. So sticking with the example of I was an institutional repository manager in an academic library. Honestly, the only thing on that sticks out is names. But that is a huge part of that work, is how does this system manage names? So that's what I'm going to focus in on. If I'm let's see, I've been an access services librarian before. There, it's a whole lot more about the spaces, the events. So start with those basic lists and look for the general topics that are relevant to your work. Scoping into a manageable size is very important. So author names, even that's too big. It needs to be author names for different groups, or how does someone entering something for the first time look at author names, or how does someone creating an account, or how does a name change work in this system? So once you have identified the broad issue of like, this thing is relevant, then you need to pin down exactly how is it relevant. It's probably going to be in multiple ways. Each of those becomes a separate issue that you need to address separately, possibly overlapping, but they may have distinct solutions. Um, uh, an optional, but I think extremely useful thing I suggest doing is creating user types to help you identify those problems. So the way I think about this, if anyone is familiar with UX design, basically for web design or for spaces and such, there's a thing you can do where, and I am not a UX person, I am going to bastardize this to anyone who really knows what they're talking about, apologies. But the way it's been explained to me is that you're essentially creating fictional characters. You're creating personas of people who might use your system. So say you're designing a library website, your character is Fiona. Fiona is a grad student. How does Fiona's navigation of the website work when they need to find a database for physics? I don't know. I don't know what physics databases are. Don't do this for this topic, because if you do that, you end up stereotyping. If your persona for restroom issues is Stephen is a non-binary employee in this library, let's make the restrooms work for Stephen, there's no way you're not just going to be either stereotyping or like completely missing the needs of other people. So what I'm telling you to do with these user types, you're not creating fictional people, you're identifying someone who needs this thing or someone who wants this thing in my library. So again, do not worry about, it is absolutely none of your business why they need that thing. This is really important. A lot of the things that help trans and gender diverse people also help cis people or also help parents or so I'll get into more examples of why that works, but this is gender inclusion work and we're recommending it because it does help trans and gender diverse people, but it also, a lot of this is just like pretty universally better. And it is none of your business why. Like, you do not need to know why Stephen the librarian, you don't need to know that Stephen the librarian is non-binary to know that Stephen the librarian needs an all-gender restroom. You only need to know the need. So, for example, these user types for a bunch of different things might be someone who needs, a library worker who needs a men's or an all-gender accessible restroom. That's one need. A patron who needs an all-gender restroom with a changing table. That's the need. It's none of your business who or why they need that. They simply need that, and it's your job to provide that. Or again, going back to the IR examples, a professor who changes their name of use, but not their legal name, and wants to update their articles already in the repository to the name that they actually use. That is specific for a reason. Some of these are specific to make the point of this is the level of detail I'm talking about here. When we're talking about scoping these issues down to something manageable and specific, like this is an incredibly particular need, but it does need to be solved for. A generic solution won't actually fix it. I wish these examples were fictional. An alum who changes their name after graduation and wants to update it on their thesis in the institutional repository. The account types are different. Thesis submission is different than professors submitting articles. The place where I was an IR manager had the multiple people told me the policy institution-wide was when I asked about changing names on theses, and I quote, "We don't change history," which is the most transphobic goddamn thing I've ever heard in my life. So this is a very different solution because that may involve working with completely different partners. Or getting out of that specific area of work, a job candidate for the library who is interviewing and needs to know, or maybe has gotten an offer and needs to figure out, can I keep getting my hormones on health insurance here? Completely different need from anything else. Different need from making sure the health insurance covers that. This is about how does someone learn that when they don't already work there? Who do they ask? Can they ask that person without outing themselves? Who knows that information? Does the person who knows that information know not to be horrible to trans people? Let's see. Or much more common, and again, this is from real life experience, a student who has not changed the name on their student ID and knows that they need to use their ID to check out a book at the circulation desk. And possibly from experience also knows that the people at the circulation desk are trained to call them by the name on the ID. I have been that student. I have stopped checking books out of that library. It was a library I worked in, and I knew not to go to the circ desk. Is this you or me?
This is me.
Great.
I'm realizing we're taking longer than I expected, so I'm going to try to go a little bit faster on some of mine. So step 2, do your research. Find out what's been done already instead of trying to invent something from scratch. You can search library databases for articles or case studies in libraries, and it also can be helpful to expand your research to other fields, which may have relevant content because there's not as much in libraries as one would hope. Two other good options include a Zotero library on trans and gender diverse inclusion for libraries that Stephen graciously started for everyone. It has 131 items as of yesterday. Another is a literature review that Stephen and I co-wrote, which is a bit more narrowly focused than the Zotero library because it's just on scholarly literature. And the Zotero library includes things like slides, magazine articles in libraries, etc. So do your research is step 2. Next slide, please. And the third is you just solve it instantly. No, so once you have the issues and you've done the research, you can develop and then implement solutions. Sometimes the actual true solutions to issues requires a fair bit of time, effort, money, and cooperation or collaboration with other library workers, library administration, university administration, whatever you have. And when that's the case, it can be useful to implement some shorter term solutions that can lessen the barrier while you do like the work on the longer term solution. It's important to keep in mind that these short-term solutions are not the finish line. They're supposed to be temporary ways to sort of lessen harm while you're doing the bigger work. And sometimes the short-term solution is just to be transparent about the issue, meaning that you provide information so that people can make informed decisions based on a clear understanding of the options that they have in this sort of exclusionary situation. And now Stephen and I are going to do examples of steps 1 through 3 on a specific thing so you can see what it looks like.
I have already been providing some examples, so we're going to move through these pretty quickly. The point of these examples, because we know that these may not be relevant to most or to some of the people in these spaces, these are intended to make the point. So say I'm in a position in the library where I have not necessarily the power to fix the restroom situation, but at least it is in my area of responsibility, and I know who to work with in hopes that they might be able to help fix it eventually. So again, like the issues that I mentioned before, like these are incredibly specific. So this might be, it's not just there are no all gender restrooms in the libraries. Where are there no all gender restrooms? Are they do they work for the people who need them? Are they accessible? Are they well signed? Is it a big library with 2 of them and someone who wants them has to go down 5 flights of stairs and hope no one was using it at the time? Let's see. It's not just the presence of them, it's what happens. This is again where those personas come in. So if you're saying, okay, a patron who needs an all gender accessible restroom enters the library. What happens when they walk up to the desk and ask where the restrooms are? It's incredibly common for people to, on the other side of the desk, to look at the person, assume, okay, that's a man. The men's restroom is over there, and stop there. That's one of the issues that you need to solve. That's a staff training issue, not an access to the restroom issue. Weird thing that I learned since transitioning. Only women's restrooms tend to have wastebaskets in the stalls. This is weird and bad. Incredibly easy fix is just go put wastebaskets in all the stalls and all the restrooms. There are libraries where there is an all-gender restroom, but someone has to go to the circ desk and ask for a key to get it opened. Whole rant here that we're not going to get into about the anti-homelessness in libraries, but that's why. There's the instruction issue, but there's also like, does someone wandering around the library, can they see the signage and maps that point them to the restroom options? Or is there signage by the gendered restrooms that tells them that there are other options? It's not enough just to have them, it's that people can find them. By problematic signage here for all gender restrooms, I mean, I don't want a sign that tells me men and women can use this restroom. I'm not either of those things. That is not necessarily more inviting, though I'll deal with it because it's the best option available. I want a sign that says this room has a toilet. Or this room has a toilet and a changing table and a urinal or whatever. Like say what's in it, not who uses it. And that goes back again to that user thing of like that user types thing of it doesn't matter who needs the thing or why, it matters what they need. That is the only thing that's your business. the current place I'm in, a bunch of us didn't know there were all gender restrooms. There are, we just didn't know about it. So we can't tell patrons that there are, and we can't use them ourselves. And another one is if I'm going to a place, I might want to look up, is there a restroom I can comfortably and safely use? If I can't find that information on the library website, that makes me hesitate a little bit more to go there. This is when where doing your research is less academic. This is much more about how does your specific institution work? So this is, again, why we're not providing instructions. I don't know how your institution works. I don't know your local regulations. And that goes both ways. Maybe there are local regulations that say you can't have an all-gender restroom. Maybe there are local regulations that say you have to have an all-gender restroom. There are regions that have both of these things, that have one or the other of these things. So this is all extremely localized. And this is what we mean by these solutions are extremely specific and you need to know your situation or learn your situation if you don't already. Here's one where you can really benefit from collaborators. If you're on a university campus and there's an LGBTQ center, talk to them. If there's a facilities group, talk to them. Find the people who can solve that problem or can help you figure out how. Very rarely are we as librarians in a position to actually just make these changes. If it's training, that's a different thing, but like I can't make there be more restrooms in my library. Campus facilities needs to construct more to make that happen. And then the solution, similarly, context specific, that you just need to do that research. And the short-term partial solutions train people to say, there's not an all-gender restroom in this building, there's one in X building over. If that makes people more aware that this is bad and needs to be fixed, and you don't like saying that, that's bad service, it is bad service. It is better than letting people not know that. And the solutions, we're going to share these slides. I'm not going to go through these in great detail. Again, like we don't want to talk about things that aren't relevant to most people and we want to move on. The solutions are once you've identified the problem, the solutions actually become pretty clear pretty easily.
Okay, so I'm going to try to not get too in the weeds here since I don't know how many people are even archivists. So for me, the most relevant area gender inclusion comes up in my work is an archival description. I'm a processing archivist, so that's what I do. When thinking about scoping your issues into manageable sizes, if I were to pretend that I had never thought about this before, I would think about what are all the places that names and assumptions about gender might come up in archival description. So 3 big areas might be access points. So name authority records or agent links or whatever you use. If you do use Library of Congress name authority records, like if someone has one for themselves, a lot of those dead name or out or misgender trans and gender diverse people or include weird information about their medical history that doesn't have to happen. So that can be an area things happen. Library of Congress subject headings, they are usually bad for queer and trans issues. They can be really outdated, inadequate, lack specificity, not use the language that people use for themselves. Biographical notes is a big area, as well as scope and content notes. So this can come up in a number of different issues. So for example, being unsure of when to describe donors or subjects as trans, like you might know somebody is trans, but maybe the collection is all blueprints of architectural blueprints. So like, would you describe the person as trans when you know that? Like, is it outing them to do so? Is it erasing trans people from history if you don't? What do you do if you processed a collection and then later it turns out the person comes out as trans? Or maybe you're just learning about gender inclusion right now and you're having this moment where you realize that you've been assuming people's pronouns based on like their names or maybe photographs, and you're not sure if you should have been doing that or what you should be doing instead. Maybe you describe photographs and you have been saying woman standing in a field because someone is wearing a dress and you aren't sure what you should be doing instead. Other ways to break this down is to think about maybe I have information someone is trans and I'm not sure if I should say something, or I don't know somebody's gender and I'm not sure what I should be doing. So there's multiple ways to kind of break down this issue, and I think it's helpful to try a couple different routes so you can cover as much ground as possible. Next slide. So doing your research, starting with that Zotero library and the lit review is a good thing. I do have a couple of options here that are helpful for these specific issues I've identified. So the Trans Metadata Collective has metadata best practices for trans and gender diverse resources. Invisible Histories has the Southern Trans Collections Guide. Both of these kind of cover those squishier scenarios where the answer is often like, it depends. Like when you describe someone as trans, like depends on a lot of things. So those are good resources for helping figure out when to do that. Travis Wagner's body-oriented cataloging is really great about describing, having guidance for describing people whose genders you don't know. And there's some chapters in Ethical Questions and Name Authority Control that Jane Sandberg edited that talks about trans people and name authority records. Also, KJ Thompson has a great article called More Than a Name, a content analysis of name authority records for authors who self-ID as trans. That one's really great, talks about other areas that gender shows up. There's a whole lot more you can read, but that would be a good starting place if you were working on this issue. Next slide. I am not going to at all read all of this. But imagine that you identified those issues and you read all those resources. You would start thinking about probably a lot of different short-term and longer-term solutions that would depend on your context. So if DEI is banned in your state, or there's lots of pushback, or there's not a whole lot of support in your library, you might choose options that are a bit more behind the scenes, and things that you don't have to ask permission for or really collaborate on. Whereas if you do have more support, maybe you can do more outward-facing things that would be on the library website. If you have a kind of a combination of context, maybe you can be public about something, but you try using different justifications. So one example that I'll look at is the second one. So donor personal papers comes out as trans, you don't know what to do. So you've already processed a collection, someone's name, let's say their name is Elliot Smith, and later you find out not from them that they transitioned and changed their name. What you should do is immediately unpublish the finding aid, and then you wait until you can actually ask the person how you should handle it. You should offer different solutions, like you can update their name on folders, on the boxes, the collection title, and the biographical note. You would probably hunt down if you've ever mentioned this collection in a research guide, or if there was an online exhibit, or if the person ever gave some sort of recorded lecture. Just think of all the names that this might show up and update those things, and then ask the person, how do they want to be described? A lot of times the how you describe someone is you have to ask, and you can't just guess what's going to work for them. You also can make a sort of policy on name changes that you could put on the archive's website. And if you work somewhere that's hostile to trans people, you don't have to say this is for the benefit of trans people. Lots of people get married, they get divorced, they go by their middle name for a while and stop doing that. People change their names all the time, so you can make it known to donors that they have the option to have their name changed. And one of the ways you can justify this is saying that it's about donor relations and, stewarding collections and thinking about archives as sort of living documents. And there's lots of ways you can sell it that isn't just this affects trans people. But the point of this slide is that there's lots and lots of specific things you can do. And when you're thinking about your solutions, you should think about your specific context and what support you have, what barriers you have, how public you can be about solving the issue, and sort of like customize it to your specific experience. Next slide. Yeah, this is you.
This one's mine. So we're getting into the concluding bit, which is great because we have 5 minutes. So we wanted to wrap up with a couple more general things about so all of these things were like, specifically, what do you do in your particular job, and how do you even figure out what that is? How do you do the learning to know what the solutions are? There are some sweeping generalizations we are prepared to make. When you are trying to help trans and gender diverse people, and honestly, this isn't even just for cis people, this is for other trans and gender diverse people who are trying to help us and each other. Again, we don't automatically know how to do any of this. Trans people are not a monolith. We have all different genders and all different experiences. So one is, we've already kind of touched on this, don't wait for someone to ask you to do this. And this one is a little bit tricky because like you do need to do the learning, but you don't need to find a random trans person and get their approval to do this work. We need you to just do it. It would be very tiring if we needed to grant individual permission to everyone who wanted to try and help. This is some of these are a little bit petty based on recent experiences. Please don't congratulate us for speaking up about gender inclusion in a meeting that you were in where you did not speak. That is not helpful. That actually tells us we are the only ones who will speak. And Kathy touched on this before. It's incredibly isolating to know that. It does not make me think better of you. It makes me know I can't trust you to say something, even though this does not change if it would be uncomfortable to speak. It is uncomfortable for me too. I do it anyway. I do it out of self-defense often. For cis people, deal with it, get through the discomfort. Caveat that if you have a reason to know that you would be targeted for other reasons, maybe you're a Black person in a library, but not a great record of treating Black people well when they speak up in a meeting, or push back on things, that is an extremely solid reason to not do that. But if it's just, I am uncomfortable saying something, or I'm not sure what to say, figure it out. We are not comfortable with this either. We just have to do it, or because if we don't, no one else will. Make it so that no one else will is not true. That would be great. Please don't vent about things about, say, there's a new anti-trans law that maybe doesn't affect you, but does affect me. Believe me, I know, or I can find out if I need to. I don't need to hear from other people, from people who aren't as affected by this. There's some nuances to this, like if it's someone you know, if it is an ongoing conversation, great. Don't walk into the office of a random coworker to vent about a thing that they presumably already know or are actively trying not to. Stop outing your relatives to random trans and gender diverse people. This happens constantly. Cis people really, really want us to know that they know a trans person. I know trans people too. I am not going to tell you their names. And also, don't waste your energy on feeling guilty if you have done these things. We're naming these because these are incredibly common behaviors. These happen all the time, every day. They're so common that guilt is a waste of energy, honestly, I think. Guilt that you don't do anything with is a waste of energy, and we really need your energy to actually do things that will help. Let's see. I think it's pretty well established. Please don't call us brave for just existing and trying to make our existence better. If you do that, please give us money. Just Venmo us.
Okay, this is our last content slide. So things are bad. I don't know if you knew. There's federal level directives such as the Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education, it's often being framed as a law. Many universities are scrambling to comply in advance and sort of over-police their own policies, initiatives, events, etc., citing these legal requirements, despite the fact that they are not actually legal requirements. They're more so threats to remove funding. Many libraries are editing or removing diversity statements, censoring the word diversity in other places. So things are not going too well. A lot of states have been passing or proposing statewide DEI bans. When they do pass, it's really unclear how they exactly apply. In some places you can acknowledge that transphobia used to exist. Maybe you can't say it does now. Some places things are actually always good and that's all you can say. So it becomes an environment folks self-censor because they're not really sure where the lines are. And that's how they want things to be. Marginalized folks are in precarious positions, whether or not we do so-called DEI work. A lot of times it feels like our colleagues rely on us to advocate on our own behalf and on behalf of patrons and community members and other marginalized groups. We're constantly told, just let me know if there's anything that I can do, after there was just a situation in which they could have done something and didn't. Stephen said, we don't really have the energy to sort of deal with all of this while also handing out assignments. So feel free to just take that on yourself, take initiative, notice where there's problems and, do something. So your role is to push back on referring to directives as laws. When universities say they're complying with the law, point out that that's not a law. I think it is important to be clear about that. Make sure that you're not complying in advance. So when you're in meetings or committees and people are encouraging sort of self-censoring, just in case, point out what they're doing and why it's bad. I've seen people do this and people don't even notice that they're complying in advance sometimes. And even just pointing it out can be helpful. Because of how DEI has been kind of handled in academia in the past decade, and especially around, 2020, so like at my workplace, a couple of us wanted to have be more strategic about doing reparative description across departments, and we wanted to just start doing the work. And the library really wanted us to create a work group, and we had to write statement of principles to put on the library website and do all these sort of things where we were talking about description without doing it. And because of how things are going this year, that group ended up on some sort of list to get reviewed by the university's lawyers to make sure we're even allowed to still do that anymore. Whereas if we would have just done the work, it wouldn't have been on a list. We'd be happily doing reparative description amongst ourselves, but because we had to write something to show how cool and decent the library was, now it's being policed. So just do the thing. You don't have to make it a PR thing. You don't have to make it big. Just doing the work sometimes instead of, thinking about making an opportunity to talk about how good the library is really important right now. Use whatever justification will get something to happen. So citing that it helps trans people might not be strategic right now. So trying alternative paths, it can be good, with bathrooms, all gender restrooms benefit literally everybody. You don't have to make it about trans people. You can also do some threat modeling, so figure out what risk factors exist in your context, what you're comfortable risking, find out about what others around you are also comfortable risking, figure out what support you have. Is anyone higher in the hierarchy willing to be sort of a shield for this work? Or are you on your own? Are there certain people that are likely to tell on you or become barriers? Like, how do you work around them? Sort of figure out how to build a community of resistance. And, tied to that, if you're going to speak up in meetings, like if you know you're going to be having a faculty org meeting and something is going to come up, you can coordinate ahead of time with people to have someone raise an issue and have people immediately jump in to agree or to add more to it. That way you don't end up with that sort of awkward silence where it might give space for someone to push back and then people become more afraid of speaking up. Also make sure that it's not the same people speaking up all the time. That can be really, really tiring, and it's very easy to write us off when it's just me complaining again about gender. And you can be really strategic about who's the one to raise issues. There are some people who have enough, I don't know, respectability or like niceness or like whatever factor that like makes administration listen more. So having those people be involved can make people take issues more seriously. Next slide. And we're ending with this lovely Leslie Feinberg quote from Stone Butch Blues. I'm not saying we'll live to see some sort of paradise, but just fighting for change makes you stronger. Not hoping for anything will kill you for sure. I also suggest people read Margaret Killjoy's essay, You Do Not Flee a Storm, which talks about how morale is a train of struggle. It's very helpful. And yeah, so she says, morale itself is a train of struggle. Our morale is under attack because our lives are under attack, but they haven't defeated us and they won't. So I think that's lovely. It's easy and rational to feel discouraged because the world is a terrible place, but it's very good for you to believe that a better world is possible. That's all I've got.
Well, that was a lot. Thank you both. What I really loved is the just do it, just get out there and act on the core values that we know we have as librarians and information professionals. We know what those are. And we need to add, communities, libraries and archives and museums are community places, and everybody should feel, and it is our obligation to make it supportive and a place that we can all be. So I'm going to ask James to give us a closing comment, and then Emil, and then Stephen and Kiahi, if you want to also add some closing comments, that would be great. And then we're going to wrap this up, and then we'll go into the unrecorded part of our session. So James, your thoughts?
Well, I want to first thank Kiahi and Stephen for smashing so much into a short time frame, and providing us with some good ideas of things that are actionable, both context and actionable information, that presentation, and I greatly appreciated that. I'm also going to quickly say thank you to Connie again for pulling this all together, and to the rest of the Beta Phi Mu board, the Omicron chapter board, for their support for this project. And I'm going to stop there because I really want to have the discussion.
Emil?
Oh, camera. There I am.
There you are.
I also really want to have the discussion. I will say I took a lot away from this. I think I came into this this presentation from Kiahi and Stephen thinking like it is really bad out there. We all know that. And I think this idea, right, that this work is needed now or really is yesterday, right, that it's non-optional. This framing of it as harm mitigation, right, feels really useful and generative to me right now. Like this sort of like beginning from this presumption that your institution is not fully gender inclusive, whether you're getting complaints or not. I think that that's such an important starting point for sort of like moving towards taking actions, understanding sort of the scope of your responsibility, and also beginning to see the ways in which you do have agency in your sort of like everyday duties. So I found that all so useful and compelling. The note about building community as well, right? Critical. And I really just want to, yeah, I want to extend a thank you, a lot of gratitude to Stephen and Kiahi for sharing your expertise and just speaking to us during this time about these critical issues.
Kiahi, last thoughts to add before we go to the discussion?
I don't have anything.
Okay. Stephen, how about you?
Just in case the chat doesn't make it to the recording, I would like to thank who I am told is Julie, who designed the flyer for putting pigeons on the flyer. We didn't think you would take that seriously, and we are delighted that you did. I have printed it out and put it on my office wall. Thank you for the pigeons.
Wonderful. All right. And with that, I'm going to hold on just a second, share my screen and announce our next colloquium, which we're very excited about, which is going to be on Thursday, November 13th at 7 p.m., where we're going to welcome back Nancy Cronick to our colloquium stage to navigate information rights during challenging times. Seems to be a bit of a theme going on here in our library world. A legal survival guide for librarians and information professionals. We're going to update everyone on what's going on the freedom to read movement here in New Jersey and how things are happening around that. And also with that, I'm really want to thank all of you for joining us, and especially our speakers. And again, always great to work with Beta Phi Mu on this project. So with that, I bid you all farewell. I'm going to stop my share. I'm also going to stop the recording, and we can go out and talk a little bit off the record.